Well, Frank, Michael, Jennifer, very good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here in lovely Darwin. I want to get your thoughts first up about the big, well, I was going to say national, but global issue at the moment. That's this US-China trade war. We're seeing the impact on the Australian market, on markets right across the region, right around the world. Jennifer, how serious is this for the Australian economy?
Look, it's very serious. It's a very delicate situation we have to navigate here. In the US, we have our greatest friend, our strongest ally and our biggest investor. In China, we have our biggest trading partner. I mean, the simple reality is we can't afford not to trade with China, but we can't afford to do it at any cost. So this is a very delicate balancing act. So what do we do as a country? We should make ourselves more competitive. We've got to make our businesses stronger. We have got to make sure that our economy, we do whatever we can, that we can control, because we won't be able to control some of this, that we can do stuff to make our businesses thrive
When you
better.
say we can't control this...
We can't control what happens between the US and China.
So you don't think our government should be putting more pressure on Donald Trump or Xi Jinping?
Well, we can exercise influence, but, we're in a very delicate position here. And some of this is going to play out and we're not going to be able to dictate the terms. What we can do is control what we can control, which is our own economy, and also places like here in Darwin, make them stronger. I mean, this is a strategic part of the country and we should be looking at it not just as a city, as a capital city, but we should be looking at it as a very strategic part of our national
well, I want to come back to
identity.
that. Michael Schneider, you run Bunnings Group in Australia. A lot of your stock, I'm imagining, comes from China. Is that right?
Yeah, substantial amount.
Right. So how much is this impacting on you at the moment, if at all?
Look, it's very early days. I think we're watching with a lot of interest. I agree with some of the things that Jennifer's saying. And I think from a business point of view, the main things to stay focused on is continuing to do the right things by our customers and continue to look at opportunities to source products from other markets. But China is incredibly important, great quality product, incredibly important relationship. So watching it very closely.
Does it make the stock, does it see the price of the stock become more volatile when we do see the currencies moving around, when we see tariffs going up and down?
At this point in time, no real impacts. But it is, again, as I said, it is something that we'll watch very closely in the months ahead.
Yeah. What about you, Frank Tudor, for Gemini? Does this trade dispute and the flow-on impact it has around the region affect your business?
Well, I go to Jennifer's points. There's certain things that we can control. So where I sit, my job is to actually deploy capital from our two shareholders, Singapore Power and State Grid, do it in a way that is responsible, that meets the requirements of the shareholders, that meets the requirements of the customers, the community, and also engages our sort of workforce and the local workforce that we work with. And we've got a great example of that recently that we've delivered in the Northern Territory with the Northern Gas Pipeline. So $1 billion investment that would not otherwise have occurred without the smart deployment of that capital. So that's what we continue to focus on.
As you mentioned, one of your owners, your 60% owner is State Grid of China. How do they view Australia at the moment, and what is their interest at the moment? You mentioned there to distribute capital when they see Australia making comments about China's activities in the region and so on. Is the appetite still there to invest heavily in Australia?
I think some of that would obviously play on the minds of many investors that are looking at Australia in terms of some of the things that are going on. But certainly from our shareholders' point of view, they're energy companies first and foremost. They have a long-term view and they want to constructively contribute to building infrastructure which a country so desperately requires to solve gas problems and the disruption that we're seeing in the energy industry more broadly.
So the message from the three of you, when people look at this trade dispute and feel justifiably worried about it, and arguably some on the market panicking a little as well, is the message that this obviously has to come to an end, but right now it's not particularly hurting at least your individual businesses?
Yeah, from my perspective, we've seen this in the past where we've had issues in 2009. I think a confluence of issues came together which caused a little bit of tension in the political relationship between China and Australia. And if there's one thing that happened through that period, investment and trade continued. There were big LNG projects and gas agreements that were signed with China, and we'd like to continue that happens as we go through this as well.
And in terms of the trade relationship with China, we saw in this week's trade surplus figures, record trade surplus figures, just how important that is. It's by far and away our largest trading partner. Do you think Australians and the Australian government are doing enough to maintain that relationship, grow that relationship, or do you get the sense that the Australian government is going to do what the US wants us to do, and that's call out China more often?
I think you've got to separate people calling out things that are clearly problems, and that's not about taking orders from the United States, it's about protecting our sovereign interest. And that's what Prime Ministers and Foreign Ministers are meant to do. But there's also a very clear understanding in the government, and you hear this time and time again, that this is a balancing act. This is about us understanding that this is a huge part of our economy, a huge part of our future. And I think government is walking a careful and constructive line on this. And I think people would be unaware of what goes on behind the scenes at a bureaucratic level, at an embassy level, to maintain that relationship. It's not in anyone's interest to not try and navigate between these two important parts of our economy and our national identity.
Well, I mean, the local example here too has been the Chinese investment in the Port of Darwin. And you would have seen a federal politician on the Labor side this week said, the government should seize control of that, should nationalise it. The local mood here seems to be, no, this is the sort of investment that's necessary. I mean, what do you all think? Is that an example of where that balance needs to be struck, and has it been struck?
Absolutely. I mean, let's just forget who owns the port. The idea that we can say after a transaction has been done, look, we've changed our mind, I mean, that will just send sovereign risk shockwaves through the investment community. But I think people forget that we've got very good institutions. The Foreign Investment Review Board is a very careful organisation. And we saw with the Huawei decision and the 5G network a very clear view about Australia's national interest. We saw with Ausgrid in the East Coast a very clear view about our national interest. So I think we should have some confidence that our institutions work pretty well.
Well, let's turn to some of the local issues about growing this economy. The prospect of the Beetaloo Gas Basin being developed is the next big thing for the Northern Territory, I suppose, and this is a pretty important development for Gemini as well, Frank. Where is that at right now? The Territory government has shifted to end the moratorium on fracking here, so how far away are we from really seeing development of that basin?
So we have two very credible players, Origin and Santos, that are working in that basin at the moment. They're going through proving development concepts, the productivity, the economics of extraction, which is really important. If they're successful in doing that, we'd expect them to scale up. And what we've already done, working very closely with a number of companies, including PwC from the Northern Territory, is build the first leg of a pipeline that's going to enable that gas to flow to the East Coast. So there's two more legs of that need to be built. And if the resource is big enough, then I think it could also come back into Darwin and add to value-adding industries here in Darwin as well.
But the talk is that there's enough gas there to supply the entire East Coast market for, I forget the number of years, but we're talking about a substantial basin there. However, this is not the easiest place to access, is it?
Certainly, there are lots of difficulties. The tyranny of distance, I think, is a big issue. So there's a lot that can be done, and it started effectively with a trip that was made from here. A delegation went to the US to have a look at how it's been exploited there. They're probably 10 to 15 years ahead. It gives us a sense of the infrastructure, the community engagement that was involved in getting them to the point that they're at. So we should be taking the lessons back and starting the pre-investment to make sure that we can gradually build as Santos and Origin and others are successful in proving up the development concepts, so that we have the broad-based community involved, we have the infrastructure being built both to the Darwin and to the East Coast.
Yeah, and can you guys do that alone? I remember in the election campaign, Bill Shorten was talking about using the Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility to finance some of this gas pipeline to get the gas from here to the East Coast. Will that be necessary?
So that would be helpful. I think encouragement from the government to almost set this up as policy would be certainly important, to recognise it as a nation-building project, a territory-building project.
And put federal funds into it?
And federal funds would always be welcome. I think it's beyond any one company, so everybody will play their part, the developers and the producers, the transporters and as ourselves, the local community. They play a very big part in actually servicing and developing the project and looking after it in its operating phase. So it really is a nation-building project, I think.
Let's turn to retail. For Bunnings here, you have 3 stores in the Northern Territory. often, and I'm sure you get this often, there's a view that, while we all go to Bunnings, we all also complain, what about the old corner store hardware shop or garden nursery, all the stores that you've replaced? How does the arrival of Bunnings in a local area really impact on that area?
Well, I think Bunnings has been in the Northern Territory for a long time, and we're really excited by the opportunities for growth and some of the things that Frank and Jennifer have talked around infrastructure investment. Are fantastic for the service industry in general. They're fantastic for consumers, and I think they draw investment from business to the market, both local business and business from around the country, and that in itself stimulates competition. And I think that's the most important thing, because creating that value for your consumer is really what the focus, certainly of Bunnings, has always been about. And we've found throughout Australia and New Zealand, where we operate, when we arrive in a market, it tends to stimulate competition, and there is a very competitive market outside of the format that we predominantly operate, particularly independent players and some of the other chain businesses that operate. So we sort of see this really sort of intense competitive ecosystem, and we have to sort of compete just as hard as everyone else. But we are very optimistic about this particular market. We've got a $50 million investment in a new warehouse that comes online to replace our Palmerston warehouse next year. And we also create significant employment opportunities. Close to 350 Northern Territorians, call Bunnings home from an employment point of view, and that's providing a lot of support for families in the community as well.
You guys have not been an early mover when it comes to online retail. You've very much been, the bricks and mortar or the big warehouses, as everyone knows, but you are now starting to make a move into online. What's it called? The click and collect?
Click and collect, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So is this going to be the future? Are we going to see continued warehouse expansion, or is this now a new direction? Are we likely to see less of the big Bunnings warehouses?
I think it's a combination of best of both, David. I think it's really about customers saying we'd like a little bit more convenience. The rollout is well underway. We've got Tasmanian and Victorian network up and running. Territory goes online early October, which will be fantastic for this market, not only Northern Territory, but the islands to the north as well, which is really exciting for us. And I think, alongside the sort of convenience of the format, the warehouse format and our smaller stores as well, we really get nice and close to the customer. And that convenience when you're doing things around the home, where you've got a project, you're running a small business, is so important.
Yeah, look, I'm sure you don't want to lose the customers like me who go in to buy one thing and end up walking out with a dozen other things. That
we love that very much, yeah, absolutely.
Don't underestimate how much people do that online, though. If the site is good...
That's true, that's guilty.
And you start flicking through it and you think, oh, I want one of those, Don't underestimate the same kind of consumption psyche applies in the online
Generally,
space.
I mean, we've talked a bit about US-China trade, but the Australian economy at the moment, you're pretty exposed to how the economy is going as to how your business is going to go. I mean, how would you describe it at the moment?
Oh, look, I think it's a mixed economy. I think there's different markets that perform at different points in time, and we certainly see that. I think everyone's seen for a long time that the Western Australian market's been a really challenging one. There's lots of talk in New South Wales and Victoria about the housing market, but the thing that we've always talked about not only is the resilience of the Bunnings model because we're exposed to the trade as well as the consumer side, but also the habit that as Aussies we tend to have around, if we're not buying and selling a house, we tend to be renovating. So we sort of see our way through those cycles reasonably well.